Hello and welcome to this tutorial on creating an integrated webshop in DynamicWeb 10. This tutorial is part 3 of the DynamicWeb Introduction tutorial series, and to follow along you'll need to have DynamicWeb installed and equipped with a simple webshop as achieved in these two previous tutorials. You can of course also just tap along if you want to get a quick insight into what an ERP integration might look like in DynamicWeb. In this tutorial, we'll be covering a basic product integration between DynamicWeb and D365 Business Central, and to do that, we'll get into adding an endpoint collection with a request and an authentication between DynamicWeb and Business Central, the Business Central integration blueprint, on running activities to show integrated products in the front end, and finally, scheduling imports. To communicate with our Business Central instance, we'll be using the default OData API, which, amongst various other entities, will let us import product data. We can add a connection to Business Central by going to Integration and by clicking up here to add a new endpoint collection. I will give my collection a name, Business Central, and optionally I can provide a description as well, and I can then select OAuth 2.0 as my authentication type. Now I already have configured an authentication, so I'm just going to paste the credentials here. And now that I have pasted my credentials, I will save my collection and within that add a request. And once again, I can provide a name, this time for the request, Business Central General OData API I'm going to go for. And then we have to locate the URL. So the URL of the OData API follows this specific format as outlined in the documentation article. So if we look at the standard PC URL for my instance here, we can see that this string here marked in yellow corresponds to the user domain name, and this string here corresponds to the environment name. So what I can do is actually just go to my Business Central instance and copy those strings from there so that I get this full BC OData URL that I can then paste into here. Since my Business Central instance has more than one company, I also need to specify a default company within my OData request. To get the list of company IDs, I can make a request to /companies and then save and finally check the check the response. So what I can see here is the ID of the first company in my instance. So I need to add that in parentheses like this. And once again, I can go ahead and save my request. And let's just verify if we sent the request here, we get a list with a single company. Now that we have a connection up and running, we can start to actually import data from the remote system. To do so, we will be using integration activities. Now, an integration activity can be a fairly complicated subject, but in its essence, it's a configuration file that contains information about how data is mapped from a source to a destination. It utilizes providers that handle different types of sources and destinations, and an integration activity also contains a list of mappings that specify from where to where the individual pieces of data should go. Now, to simplify this configuration, we have made a series of predefined integration activities that are bundled together in what we call the blueprints. To install the blueprints, we can go to Apps and then All Apps and search for Business Central right up here. And we can then install this one from the context menu right here. The blueprints also utilize the OData provider and the ecom provider, so we need to also install these. The OData provider is here and ecom right up here. Good. So Once these are installed, we can head to the integration area once again and see that we now have 4 activity groups, each with a list of integration activities. To import product data from Business Central, we will be using the item categories and the items activities here. Starting with categories, we can see here that we already have some mappings defined, which we can check out in detail here. And we also have a pair of providers defined, but we need to connect it to the endpoint that we previously defined by going to source and selecting the endpoint from the list here. We can then go ahead and run the activity. And if we check the log, we can see here that it was in fact a success. We can then go to items and do the same thing. As you can see, this activity also has a series of mappings defined, but this time we want to make a little more configuration. We have to select the source endpoint again, but we can also go to repository index to choose an index to be rebuilt every time an integration activity is run. So let's select the index that we made in the previous tutorial, responsible for querying our products. Now let's go ahead and manually run this activity as well. And since we can see it was a success, let's go ahead and check out our front end, where we can now see that we not only have the 2 products that we have manually defined, but also 2 products that were imported from our Business Central. Now finally, we can go back to the integration activity here and click Add to Schedule to automatically set this activity to be run every day, for instance. That is it for this tutorial. Thank you for watching and best of luck with your integration.